Okay, so, well, thank you, Anthony, for this very thorough introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with Rachael and Claire to talk about this book, Metaphysical Animals. It's coming out, as Anthony said, on the 3rd, so in a few days, there you go. And hello to all of you. As I see, you are from all around the world. It's quite amazing. I didn't expect this. So a note about how we thought about this conversation. We thought we discussed how we should structure it, and we sort of decided that we should let it be very fluid, so that as many aspects of this book could unfold, because as you will see, there's a lot in this book, a lot is covered in this book. So I'm going to introduce the book a bit, and then I will let the discussion flow and see where it takes us. Is that okay, Rachael and Claire?
Yeah, okay. We're curious.
Me too. So as Anthony said, this book is about 4 philosophers: Elizabeth Anscombe, Iris Murdoch, Mary Midgley, and Philippa Foot. How they met in Oxford just before the beginning of the Second World War, how the friendship developed, and how they developed their philosophical views on a vast number of different topics. You really cover everything, but practically everything. Human happiness, goodness, freedom, paradoxes, intentionality, action, sensation, and a lot more. And how they were also influenced by their contemporaries and their mentors. And all of this is said in Oxbridge, because again, as Anthony said, they all studied at Oxford, that's where they met. But for instance, Anscombe worked at Cambridge, was a professor at Cambridge, and her family lived in Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. And that's also where she put together, in effect, the philosophical investigations. So it's set in Oxbridge, but it's also set during the Second World War in England and in Europe more broadly. So there are many threads that we could pick up to start a conversation. And in presenting the story of these 4 philosophers, Clare and Rachael uncover and give a voice to a really, again, impressive number of women and refugee scholars that were contemporaries of the quartet. This group of women have come to be known as the wartime quartet. So these people include Susan Stebbing, Dorothy Emmett, Mary Glover. I always think I say this name wrong, Lotte Lebowski, Simone Weil, Donald McKinnon, very many people. We'll talk about some of them today. And by including these figures, what Clare and Rachael have managed to do is connect the preoccupation of these 4 women, these 4 philosophers, I should say, to the metaphysicians of the previous centuries, all the way back to the ancients. Now, this book, what I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, what the main aim of this book, I suppose, is to bring to light the philosophical background that was needed to be restored before these 4 philosophers could put together an ethical theory, a naturalist ethical theory. You nod, so I continue. Okay. And this background was a way of seeing human beings, not as beings that inhabit a world that is valueless, that in which whatever value is to be found is a projection of ours, like the theories of ethics at Oxford at the time, or the French existentialist theories made it out, but as beings who as animals whose very form of life is intimately and fundamentally connected to value, and who are, by nature, we are metaphysical animals. So we're animals that by nature wonder and question the big questions in life, animals that love and care for the world they find themselves in and the people they find themselves with. So I think that a good place to start would be by giving an idea to the viewers of what it is that the quartet contributed in terms of metaphysical framework and ethics. And maybe a way to introduce that is to talk about the In Parenthesis project just a bit, so we can see how you guys got how your interest in these four philosophers began.
Sure. Well, we could start with just talking about in parentheses first, maybe. So we set up in parentheses in 2015. Rachael had just written her amazing introduction to Anscombe's Intention, which is highly recommended for those of you who haven't read it. And she just submitted her manuscript, her draft, to the publisher. And she came to visit me in Vienna, where I was on maternity leave. And we spoke about a letter that Mary Midgley had written into The Guardian in 2013, which we'd both read. And in this letter, Mary is responding to a suggestion that Jonathan Wolfe makes. He'd wondered, like, why is it that, Iris Murdoch, Anscombe, Foote, Midgley, and he included Mary Warnock, why is it that these 5 women came to be distinguished philosophers in the 20th century, a generation unlike anything that followed them? And he wondered, is it something to do with the fact that they were at Oxford during the war, and in Mary Warnock's case, just after the war? And Mary Midgley wrote back and she said, yes, it has got something to do with it. The fact that the men were away meant that our, talents could get the attention that they deserved. And this immediately struck us, and we thought this was fascinating. And when Rachael came out to me in Vienna, we were chatting, she submitted her book. She said, oh, when I retire, I'd love to write a book about those 4 women. And I said, oh my goodness, well, you should do it now. We should do it. I want to help you. So, and we were with our dear friend as well, Luna Dolezal. And so we thought, let's do something about this. And we got a little BA grant, and we set up in parentheses. And initially we reached out to quite a lot of different people, because I'm a philosophy of perception. Rachael does have expertise, obviously, in Anscombe, philosophy of action and Wittgenstein, but it was, obviously very ambitious and a mammoth task to try and kind of constellate these 4 women philosophers and see, what did they have in common. I think what was really initially incredibly striking was that they weren't just contemporaries. Initially, we thought they were just there at the same time. But then, of course, we discovered that they were friends. And indeed, then we began to discover, as we read their philosophy, that they, in fact, influenced each other philosophically as well. And do you want to say something, Rachael? Oh, muted.
You'd think we'd all be good at unmuting ourselves by now. Yeah, thanks, Claire. That was right. And I think one of the things that kind of got us excited initially was that when we sort of just mentioned these 4 women to particularly to our students, our female students, and just said, oh, did you know there were these women and they were friends and they were doing philosophy together? And, it was just such an exciting image, and it made us sort of reflect on how unusual that idea was of people doing philosophy together, let alone women doing philosophy together. So the project, I suppose, from the very beginning had this idea of that we really wanted to model a different picture of both the individual philosopher, but also a philosophical practice within the project. So we always had this kind of dual interest in uncovering the actual detail of the philosophy that's in the women's work, but also using the women and their story as a kind of picture that could bring about some kind of change. And I think that kind of dual purpose, I think Claire will agree with me, kind of shaped the way we approach the writing of the book, and why the book has the kind of form and has some of the features, Elly, that you've already mentioned. I mean, just to kind of ground that out a bit philosophically, any those of you who know about Murdoch's philosophy will know this very famous line where she says, man is a creature who makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble those pictures. So she has kind of at the heart of her philosophy this idea that humans are kind of image and picture making and storytelling creatures, and through the stories that they tell and the pictures that they have available to them, it can actually shift who they are and how they interact with the world. So we were kind of really taken by that sort of idea at the heart of Iris Murdoch's philosophy, and we wanted to try and actualize that, if you like, within the book and within the way we talked about the women's philosophy.
I would say as well, very early on, we were lucky enough to, meet Mary Midgley. She lived in Jesmond in Newcastle, and I'm around the corner. Rachael lives there. So we were very quickly visitors to Mary's little, I don't know, sheltered housing, I suppose. And yeah, so another aspect, I think, of Mary's philosophy in particular that influenced us and influenced the way we approached in parenthesis and then in turn the book was this idea that philosophy is a human need. It's something that humans need to get by. So her idea is that, very often our concepts sort of stagnate and they no longer serve the purpose they were sort of created or conjured to serve. And at that point, a philosopher has to come in a bit like a plumber and to try and kind of diagnose where there's a blockage and try and make thought flow again. And I think that we both felt quite stuck, Rachael and I, in philosophy. I think the form of traditional analytic philosophy was quite stultifying for us. I can certainly say that for me personally. And I think, meeting Mary, like, she's so creative. And I mean, if anyone's ever, you should read her prose, like, it's just so pithy and open. And this, just the very idea that, philosophy is a human need and that there's loads of different ways to practice philosophy. And, that really there's something, we ought not to sort of abnegate our responsibilities as philosophers by just sort of kind of coming up with problems and puzzles that you just publish in journals and so on. So I do think she influences along that dimension as well, Rachael, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would totally say that. And the other thing I thought you were going to say about meeting Mary, which I think has also influenced us and the book, was just the kind of privilege and the feeling of being in a room with this amazing woman who was in her 90s, her late 90s at the time, and who was completely still doing philosophy and still thinking philosophically, and who could kind of talk to us about people like Wittgenstein and Austin and Ryle and Murdoch and Collingwood firsthand, who could, and the way she would talk about them, it was like they just left the room. It was really to have this kind of connection through a kind of concrete other with this sort of submerged tradition and with all these people who until that point were kind of on our bookshelf was, I mean, it was so kind of enlivening philosophically and personally. And I suppose it was, all that was kind of feeding into this sense that if we were going to write a book about this philosophy, it would have to in some way also be this picture and also be this story and also be this kind of connection. And so obviously the kind of form of joint biography with a kind of philosophical counter twist started kind of emerging out of all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
I met Mary Midgley once at the Hay on Wye festival, and then subsequently exchanged a few emails with her. And she's an absolutely brilliant philosopher. It came out in everything she said. Every sentence, there was something about her anyway. But and she had a very synthetic mind, and she was one of those people who, of course, she's well known, but she was never an academic star, and I think it was because of her style of writing. And I was wondering whether the women in parentheses title has something to do with that or not. What is the in parentheses? What is this parenthesis?
Yeah, I mean, initially the thought was that and I guess like one of the things to say is, so we started this project in 2015, and I think academic philosophy has changed an enormous amount actually in the last 7 years. So what was definitely true then is becoming less true now, I think. But the thought was that, often women's ideas go unattributed, or they're not picked up until a man publishes them. And when they are attributed, it's often a kind of footnote or a parenthesis that says, oh, so-and-so says something a bit similar, or, but there isn't the proper attribution of the thought. And in relation to these 4 women, we were just astonished by the extent to which their thought has profoundly shaped 20th century philosophy and fed into the work of all these male philosophers who everybody's writing PhDs on. And somehow that fact wasn't sort of properly understood or acknowledged. Now, of course, as soon as we started to use or to kind of tell their story, and through telling their story to uncover all these other people, it turned out, you know, there was so much of 20th century philosophy that hadn't even made it into parentheses. It was off the margins. But yeah, it was about this idea of, you know, moving them out of the parenthesis and giving them a kind of critical mass and a central. Is that right, Claire?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I mean, I don't want to name names or anything, but I think I was reading a paper at the time by Hilary Putnam, is maybe one of his last papers, and yeah, there's a quick summary of one of Anscombe's views in parenthesis, and I think it's wrong the way he characterizes it, and I was quite horrified by this. But also we have this idea, Rachel, do you remember that the brief period where the men go away for war, that's like a small window,
yes,
you know, where other things happened at Oxford. So this is like a window, like a kind of bracket, because once the men came back, you know, things kind of sort of resettled back into the passions that, you know, the rhythm that was there before they left. But that was the initial idea. I mean, as it turned out, the more work we did unearth this sort of, it's not hidden. I mean, it's there for anyone to read, but there is a kind of alternative, if you like, history or narrative of mid-century 20th century analytic philosophy, mid-20th century analytic philosophy. There's loads of figures that were very influential at that time that no one has heard of now. And some of them are hopefully brought to life in our book. Yeah.
Yeah, so for our viewers, what Claire is talking about is that when these women went up to Oxford, men were away, they were drafted in the war. So that gave them, you said in the beginning, but just in case some viewers didn't hear this, this gave them the space to develop their ideas, but also to be heard, right?
Yeah, and yeah, well, I was just going to say, you know, many things changed, and so, like for example, there was more seminars than one-to-one tutorials. Or often people were taught in groups of 1 to 2. And there's also a huge influx of refugee scholars, and we think that's extremely significant for thinking about the intellectual formation of these women. If you think of like Gilbert Ryle was kind of, he's the main figure that you associate with mid-century Oxford philosophy. But when our women were there, the main men, if you like, that were running the show were David Ross, so he was the provost of Oriel. There was A.D. Lindsay, Sandy Lindsay. He's a really important figure. He was the master of Balliol, and he was the first socialist master of an Oxford college. And I'm trying to think who was it? Well, Collingwood was there, of course. But I think, sorry, the significance of David Ross, he was also the president of the British Academy, and he sponsored quite a number of refugee scholars from the Warburg Institute and associated scholars. He sponsored them, and he gave them like research and teaching positions in Oxford. So yeah, it was just a completely different milieu, you know, pedagogical milieu that these women were in. I mean, people have said that, I don't know if it's true, but people have said that, you know, Oxford was something of an academic backwater before these refugees kind of arrived on the pavements. So yeah, I mean, do you want to add to that, Rachel?
Well, no, I mean, I suppose so, just in terms of the chronology. So the book starts with them arriving at Oxford, and that's just before the outbreak of the war. So they have a kind of year to settle in, and, you know, the war is on the horizon. And this is, of course, just the moment where, you know, a few years earlier, A.J. Eyre had published Language, Truth and Logic, which was this kind of declaration of war on metaphysics. And he'd kind of declared that speculative metaphysics is over and that philosophy is over, effectively. And this kind of manifesto was becoming very sort of loudly talked about and very exciting for the undergraduates in particular. But then when the war begins, not only AJ but Austen and Rachael and also the young men of that generation who were kind of excited by this this kind of anti-philosophy manifesto are all off in war. So the women are taught by so in the second chapter of our book, which is the kind of it's called Learning in Wartime, we look at some of the people who were very influential teachers of them. So we have a conscientious objector, which is Donald McKinnon, a woman, which is Mary Glover, a refugee, which is Heinz Cassera, and somebody else who...
H. Price.
Oh yeah, and an old man, of course, yeah, H. Price. So they were kind of exposed to a philosophy that was partly out of date, partly unfashionable, partly, coming through from a tradition outside of the UK. So when the men come back after the war, the women are already kind of older, maturer. They've gone away, they've done war work, they've had this philosophical training, and they're kind of ready to take on the philosophy that then becomes dominant through the work of Austen in particular in that post-war period. So yeah, so the sort of parenthesis of the war gives them this kind of space to breathe, but into that space come these influences that they otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to.
Would you like to talk to us about what they introduced in terms of, well, I don't know if you want to focus more on their ethics or the background first.
I suppose, well, sorry, Claire, do you want to?
No, you go first and then I can jump in.
Well, I think one of the things that we don't do in the book is go straight into the ethics. I think that was something that you picked up on, Elly. We really...
It's in the Q&A, it's in the questions that are coming in. That's why I thought we'd talk about it a bit, because then...
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry, yeah, I'm not...
I don't know if you can see the questions. I can, yes. Yeah,
okay. So the question is, so what was the question in the Q&A?
No, we'll talk about the questions in a bit. We have 10 more minutes to talk about it, but I thought maybe you say the book is about how 4 women brought philosophy back to life. Well, how did you bring philosophy back to life?
Yeah, good.
That's a better question.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so there's a number of different, the way Claire and I think every answer has about 15 different questions. So the Back to Life subtitle has lots of different meanings, and we'll take turns and see how many of them we can get through. So one idea, which I suppose is kind of the obvious one, is that the kind of so Mary Midgley describes logical positivism, so AJ's philosophy, as ethical weed killer. So she describes it as this kind of totalizing, life-killing force. So you wipe ethics and value out of the world and you're left with something very arid and dead. So the idea of bringing philosophy back to life, one aspect of that is kind of replanting in the world the materials that you need to kind of push back against that sort of weed killer that air lays down. So that was one aspect of it. That's the kind of ethical slant on it. But Claire will tell you another one.
So another way of thinking about the notion of back to life is the notion of back as a kind of reorientation. So a reorientation of attention and philosophical attention back to life as in concrete reality. Mm-hmm. So it has that kind of reorientation kind of import. And there we're thinking particularly of the work of Iris Murdoch and her work on attention and just vision and moral vision. Mm-hmm. I mean, you ask what the background is. I mean, many of you will know that Anscombe said we need to have an adequate philosophical psychology before we can do ethics. Murdoch is very keen on philosophy, or she introduces the term, in fact, moral psychology. That should be properly attributed to her. Anscombe usually uses the word philosophical psychology rather than moral psychology. And both of them are quite adamant that we need to kind of get the philosophy of mind, if you like, generally speaking, right before we do ethics. So yeah, Murdoch's contribution, I said, is this notion of reorientation of attention and vision. What is the third idea, Rachel?
Well, so somebody's just put this in the chat. Naomi's put what back to the rough ground in the chat, which of course is Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein has this idea that we need to replant language and humans in their proper soil. So back to the rough ground. So we need to resituate philosophy in the context of human life, and it's there that we're going to be able to see clearly what's happening. So yeah, so the other aspect of Wittgenstein is the notion of a form of life. And what I think is really, to me in particular, I think because my background is in Wittgenstein, has been working with Clare on how this notion of the form of life that Anscombe finds in Wittgenstein, how she links that back to the Aristotelian notion of a life form. And something kind of incredibly exciting and dynamic and creative happens when she kind of sees how to connect the kind of classical education that she began at Oxford, where they studied Aristotle and Plato, with this notion of a form of life that is in Wittgenstein's thought. And she has this amazing remark that she makes, where she says, until she met Wittgenstein, the philosophers of the past were like statues, and Wittgenstein brought them back to life for her. And I think one of the things that if you ever read any of Anscombe's writing, where she engages with the philosophers of the past, and Hume is a big interlocutor for her, but also Parmenides and Plato and all sorts of, whenever she's engaging with a philosopher of the past, it's like they're in the room with her. It's like they're a living interlocutor. And that's, that gives her work kind of humor, because she's not at all, she can be quite irreverent with it. But there was something about, the way in which Wittgenstein brings this ancient tradition back to life for us now that was really kind of important.
Yeah, and I think I'm just thinking now of Iris Murdoch's research proposals kind of in the late 40s. She complains all the time about what she calls shallow milk and water ethics. And she's thinking here of the ethics of the Intuitionists, Pritchard and Ross. And she looks to Sartre at that point, and she's thinking, I want to write about what she uses the word man, but like humans with flesh and blood in their veins, men that go to war, that go to the cinema, that make love, and so on. So in that sense, she's, trying to bring philosophy back to life as well. There is a third one we haven't glossed, Rachel.
Yeah, we'll probably remember it in a bit. But I think one of the things that we've learned, or certainly that I've learned through working on these women and with these women, and I think Iris Murdoch's really helped us to think about this, is the real difficulty of bringing philosophy back to life. Like it seems like nothing should be easier than to ask philosophical questions whilst paying close attention to reality. But of course, what we learn, particularly from Iris Murdoch, and I think once you kind of connect Iris Murdoch's philosophy of attention to the account of perception that you can draw out of Elizabeth Anscombe, you start to see just the enormous difficulty of that kind of task, and it really makes you realize how sort of monumental it is to be able to do that. Observations that Philippa Foot makes in a sort of very kind of refined and sort of no fireworks way, you realize the amount of sort of work that is required to kind of reground philosophical questions in life. So,
well, of course, like Wittgenstein says, you have to go back to the beginning. So if you have to go back to the beginning, that's an enormous amount of work, yes.
Anscombe at one point, she says, when Iris Murdoch arrives at Cambridge to do her postgraduate studies, the first thing that Elizabeth Anscombe says to her is, in philosophy, we must start from scratch. And it takes a very long time to reach scratch.
That was a guiding thought for us, wasn't it? So really the philosophy of action and perception is the background to what we've produced, I would say, and the underlying metaphysical epistemology that goes with that. There is some discussion of virtue, but that only comes in once we've sort of filled in that background.
Yeah, and it's maybe worth saying that the book, in terms of its temporal scope, kind of reflects our interest in, if you like, bringing them back to scratch, reaching scratch, because we go from just before the war only up until 1956. So we end with this kind of sort of now fairly well-known moment where Elizabeth Anscombe attempted to block Truman, President Truman, former President Truman, being awarded an honorary degree from Oxford University on the grounds that he was a mass murderer. And she failed in that. But we end with that scene because we wanted to kind of tell this story that shows that where you follow the women as they pick up all the pieces and gather what they need to reach that moment of a beginning. And then from the mid-50s onwards, which is where they're producing the work that you'll all be familiar with, it's like they'd done, they'd given themselves that firm ground beneath their feet, if you like, and then everything flows from that. And that's what's so kind of exciting, I think.
Yeah, we have put in, absolutely, I agree 100%, Rachel, with that characterization. We have put in flashes of their later philosophy, just select flashes, to help the reader get a sense of like what a kind of unified metaphysics and epistemology would look like if you draw from these four women's work.
Well, I thought the book reads very much like a puzzle. You start with all sorts of things, and then it slowly comes together. And of course, it culminates in that incident with Anscombe at Oxford.
We wanted to write it like that. We wanted to use the kind of form of a philosophical argument, but try and lay it out in narrative form. So we start with a puzzle. So we start with Anscombe is objecting to Harry Truman being awarded a degree, and she's puzzled, like, why are people in Oxford not seeing what she can see, namely that as she thinks he's a mass murderer. And we use that to kind of generate puzzles about consequentialism and ethics. And the idea is that the book then fills in the background that you need in order to see what Anscombe sees and to understand the particular objection that she's putting before the convocation as to why he shouldn't be awarded a degree.
So I think this connects to our questions. I think it's time for us to start answering the questions. And I think the first question connects to this. So I don't know if you can see them, but I'll read the first one out by
They're going so fast. I
It's so
can't
many.
really take them in. Yeah.
No, I think you're looking at the chat.
Oh.
There's a different chatty thing.
Okay.
So the question here is, much of the ethical work of the quartet seems to be about establishing an objective basis for ethics. What is at stake in this striving for objectivity, and why, after thousands of years of philosophy, does it remain such an elusive goal for ethicists, kind of a holy grail? Thank you for this great discussion.
Thanks, Darren. That's a great question. Clare, I think, will solve the Holy Grail in 3 short sentences. I mean, we could say. I mean, I can say something just very quickly about that. It's really insightful. This thought that the ethical work of the quartet is about establishing an objective basis for ethics, and it's a nice point to mention Philippa Foot, because we haven't really talked about her that much in what we've said so far. So Philippa Foot before the war was really interested in philosophy of mind, and she says that it was at the moment when the news came out of the concentration camps and the Holocaust that she realized she would have to become an ethicist. So she has this real kind of profound moment where she realizes that, the ethical, the dominance within ethics of logical positivism and emotivism and non-cognitivism and subjectivism, or whatever you want to call it, that was in play after the Second World War. She was kind of physically repulsed almost by the fact that this left her speechless in the face of the atrocities of the war. So for her, it's it's the war itself that gives that drive towards a kind of objectivism in ethics. It's kind of practical living form, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you can't underestimate the fact she says at one point, we did not think this was possible when, you know, they learned about the Holocaust. There was a real, I mean, if you take really seriously what she said, we couldn't believe this was possible, like reality had changed. So I think, yeah, I'm probably not adding anything to what you said now.
I mean, I think just going back to why it's so difficult, I mean, Elizabeth Anscombe's answer to that, and I think that this would probably be my answer to this as well, is, you know, you can't just get objectivism in ethics from just doing ethics. You can only get it if you've got a complete picture of human life and of human reality and of the world and of action and perception and metaphysics and epistemology and everything. So I think often, you know, ethicists or ethics proceeds as if it can, you know, it can get to objective moral judgment somehow without doing the hard work of philosophy of psychology, which of course is what Anscombe says. And I think one of the things that we have kind of become convinced of through writing this book is, you know, the amount of work that has to happen first before there's any chance of getting something that might look like objectivity into ethics.
I think that's a good answer.
Yeah. We're still pretty far off the Holy Grail, actually, with that in mind. Anyway.
Plenty of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so here Michael Bavage, congratulations on your book. It's a beautiful written account of a fascinating period in philosophical thought. Wait, I can't see anything. I should do this. Yes. Existentialism quickly became influential after the war. Iris Murdoch had a more positive attitude towards it than the others. Could you say something about that? Why Murdoch seemed to like it a bit more than the others? Did she?
Well, I don't know. Then Foote, Midgley, and then Anscombe. I suppose she took seriously human freedom. Consciousness is extremely important for Murdoch, and that's what's fundamental, I suppose, to Sartre's picture, the distinction between the pour soi and the en soi, freedom and consciousness. So I think that from that perspective, she was more interested in it than the others, certainly than Mary. Mary was pretty anti-existentialism, I would say. But as you probably know, she developed really strong critiques of existentialism as early as 1951, and then her book Sartre, Romantic Rationalist, 1953. She develops pretty strong critiques of existentialism there, and she noticed that there's a commonality between logical positivism in particular, as exemplified by Richard Hare, and Sartre's brand of existentialism as well. Both kind of evacuate value from the world. So I'm not sure. She certainly takes things on board, and there's lots of different. There are different echoes, I think, of sort of Sartrean thought and ideas in Murdoch's sort of middle period. She doesn't just lambast it. There are some traces of influence, I would say.
Okay. Rachel, anything to add, or shall I?
Well, one of the bits of the book that we tell is after the war. Iris Murdoch, she had a sort of series of unfortunate events in her personal life, and she was desperate to get out of England, and she joined UNRWA, and she was stationed in Europe, and she goes and she listens to Sartre in Belgium, and she's kind of, she's completely blown away by the kind of celebrity and the excitement and the scene and being abroad and the war's over. So there's a kind of you know, there's so much life in Iris Murdoch, and she's so, you know, she's just drawn to things. And she, you know, she has this in the Iris Murdoch archive at Kingston, if you ever get a chance to go, there's this gorgeous cloth notebook that she bought specially for this lecture, and it's just filled with notes and notes and notes and notes and notes. So she has this kind of, you know, this ability to sort of just see what's so thrilling about something that's presented to her. So I think that kind of thrill of the connection with Sartre kind of plays out in her in the sort of 40s and 50s, whilst at the same time she's kind of coming to see as a philosopher that there's something sort of deeply problematic about the way in which existentialism is attempting to remake a connection with life.
I mean, I think one thing as well that we're quite keen on emphasizing, it, she is reading other existentialists at the time. So Gabrielle Marcel, for example, she's also reading Martin Buber. In fact, we think that Dorothy Emmett gave a copy of Martin Buber's I and Thou to Murdoch in maybe 1943. So Buber and Marcel, they make a distinction between human relationships and relationships, for example, between me and Rachel, that would be an I and thou relationship, or a relation that you might bear to an object, that might be an I-it relationship. And she, like reading these works, I mean, I think she develops a critique of Sartrean existentialism through reading those Christian existentialist critiques of Sartre. So I think it's worth just putting that out there, because I think there is an idea abroad that, you know, Iris sort of conjured her critiques of Sartre completely sort of by herself, uninfluenced by other writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And there are people around like Donald McKinnon and Catherine Farrer who are reading and translating French philosophy at that period. And Philippa Foot is reading all the same stuff as Iris Murdoch. They're sharing copies of the new French philosophy. So it's not that Iris Murdoch is on her own in that, but you know, certainly that's the kind of, yeah, she writes the most kind of engagingly about that philosophy, and she's totally starstruck by Sartre initially.
Another question by David Lohner. Hi Claire and Rachel, thanks again for this. My question is, what role, if any, did the self-conscious peculiarity or eccentricity often attributed to male philosophers in early 20th century Oxbridge have in the kind of professional lives lived by the quartet, and the significance as a specific school of thought? What was the role of post-war British educated class identity in this story?
Well, I'm not sure I got all of the question, but
Yes.
three of the women went to private schools. They're privately educated. Iris Murdoch got a scholarship. Mary went to a very progressive school called Down House, and the headmistress there, Olive Willis, was really influenced by Dewey's philosophy of education. So just in terms of their background, Anscombe, Midgley and Murdoch were, you know, profoundly, we now say, privileged in terms of the education that they received. Strangely, although Foote was sort of posher, if you like, than those three, her education wasn't as good at all. Her mother wasn't keen on her getting educated, so she was taught at home by some tutors. I think she had a year in a school at Ascot, but on the whole, she didn't have the same level of education at all. So she wasn't able to, for example, I think she had some training in Latin. She had some tutoring in Latin before she went up, but she wasn't in a position to do the course that the other women did, which was Mods and Greats. She did PPE, which was sometimes thought of as, Modern Greats, or it was a Greekless degree. And there's a particular characterization of it. I think it was, I can't think of the exact characterization of it, but it was basically for those who had a less rounded education, the PPE degree. So there's no question that these women, particularly the three that I've highlighted, you know, had a privileged education. They were, I think, only around 4% of women at that period would have had the kind of education they had. I'm not sure if that was David's question.
I think the first part was about eccentricity, and I mean, I'm not sure, David, whether you're thinking about the kind of the performance of eccentricity by the men at the time, if you like. So, you know, the tics and stuff of Wittgenstein, or whether you're thinking more about in terms of their legacy. And I suppose one of the things that we were quite interested in writing the book was trying to get away from those sort of stories and kind of break the hold of those kind of cliched representations, both of the men but also of the women. And I think in particular Elizabeth Anscombe is somebody who we know about through these kind of entertaining stories that were usually told about her behind her back by men who are intimidated by her. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was try to break through all of that and actually connect again with the individual human beings who were doing this stuff. And we were so, I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about, but that really shaped the book, I think, was all the incredible things we found in the archives. I mean, it was just astonishing to be working in archives rather than through kind of, you know, secondhand stories, and to be reading letters, you know, and tutorial reports and diaries and journals, and seeing, you know, even somebody like Austen or R.M. Hare, who kind of exist as caricatures now, to see them again as sort of actual real human beings who are attempting to navigate a world that is kind of, you know, changing in ways that are quite horrifying, and trying to, you know, keep up with that. So I think we really didn't want to tell a kind of sort of art, we didn't want a kind of arch tone or a kind of ironic distance from these people. We really wanted to try and as much as we could let them all be people. And so we hopefully we don't have so many of those kind of, oh look, here's another eccentric story. I mean, you can't obviously talk about Wittgenstein without some of that, but we did try to not kind of add to that, if you like.
Sorry, I'm thinking about your answer. There are quite a few questions. I don't think we have time to go through them all, but here's another one. For Wittgenstein, philosophy has, from Naomi Schimann, for Wittgenstein, philosophy had long ago lost its footing. Was that so for these four women, or were they more focused on much more recent trends like logical positivism?
Well, they're also focused on intuitionism, I would say. So they're interested in I think you might want to say something about this, Rachel, but I think before logical positivism, there was another view in ethics, sometimes called intuitionism. And the idea there was that you can't look to some kind of moral theory to tell you how to act. When you're wondering what to do, there's no moral theory that can guide you. The idea is that you just kind of get into a position, look at the situation, and your moral faculties will tell you what it is your duty to do. And we have all kinds of different duties. We have different duties to our neighbors, to our wives, to our parents, and so on. But the thought is that, you know, you get into a position at a moment, and somehow you can apprehend what your duty is. And on this view, it doesn't matter what your motives are, as long as you do your duty. And I think that Anscombe in particular, you know, found this really problematic, because it matters, the nature of the act that you're performing, you know, the motivation with which you're acting, your intention, in fact, is determinative of what you're actually doing. So I would say that, yeah, it's not just logical positivism at all. Anscombe in particular, and Murdoch, they're looking back to intuitionism also, but at the same time, they're also quite influenced by the intuitionists. So we would see a kind of a common thread kind of linking the intuitionists and these women, in particular the idea that there is an objective moral reality, but also that it is somehow apprehendable. But as Rachel said, the thing with our women is that they realize how very difficult it is to try and get close to moral reality, to try and see what's real, what's necessary, what's needed. Whereas for the intuitionists, it was just a matter of, letting your moral faculties do the work, just sort of getting into position and letting them do the work. So, so yeah, it's not just logical positivism. And I mean,
I think as well, like they do all probably to varying degrees share an idea that something went wrong with the moderns. And that if you want to kind of, I mean, Iris Murdoch says in philosophy, you should go where the honey is. And for her, the honey is all in Plato. And for Murdoch, for Midgley, it was in Plato too. And for Elizabeth Anscombe, it's in Plato and in Aristotle and in Aquinas. So they all, to varying degrees, they think that something went wrong, way, as you say, a longer time back than certainly Eyre is not a kind of a worthy opponent for the kind of intellectual clout of these women. So one of the things that hopefully kind of comes through in the book is, again, this thing that we talked about earlier, that through Wittgenstein, exposure to Wittgenstein's later thought, they find this way to reanimate the ancient philosophy that they studied as undergraduates, if you like, and they kind of draw some kind of incredibly powerful metaphysics from the ancients kind of right up to the modern, using this sort of magic that they get from Wittgenstein. So yeah, it's definitely not the case that they've got their sights on Eyre in particular. It's just that the kind of shock of being left with Eyre when you've just had the Holocaust and an atom bomb is kind of the immediate kind of proximal cause of them all going, oh my God, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
But in answering that, they definitely find they have to go further and further back.
I mean, one thing Mary says is that, with respect to Eyre and Hare, they all respond with a joint no. There's a joint no. But then Mary goes on and she says, and from that joint no, so they all said no, a lot of metaphysics would follow. So they need to yoke back together fact and value, but not just fact and value. They have to yoke back together mind and matter and intellect and will, and it's there that you begin to see the requirement for a different philosophy of action and perception. Metaphysics and epistemology. So yeah.
So we have many questions, but since we are bringing all these women together, there's one question by an anonymous attendee who asks whether there are any topics on which there was strong divisive disagreement between the women.
Yes. Well, this is like an Anscombe one, Rachel. So,
well, I mean, in the period of the book, with they're kind of coming together to generate a joint response, this joint no, and to kind of map out the metaphysics that they're going to need to kind of ground out that no. The places, so we have them kind of largely in agreement in the period of our book. I mean, they each have different tastes. So, for example, when Elizabeth Anscombe first meets Wittgenstein, she says, that she's in a state of besotted reverence. Now, she does grow out of that, but initially she's just sort of blown away by Wittgenstein. Whereas Mary Midgley, who's a sort of real pragmatist, she's sort of completely unimpressed by Wittgenstein. She thinks, who is this sort of God guy who thinks that they're the bee's knees. So I think they have different attitudes towards the philosophers around them that kind of inflect their philosophy. But the big disagreements come when it comes to kind of practical ethics, because of course Anscombe is a Catholic, and her and Philippa Foot have a big falling out in print on the question of abortion, and Philippa Foot's kind of famous / infamous trolley problem example comes out of that argument with Elizabeth Anscombe in print. So I think when it comes to kind of the specific practical application of their ethics, Elizabeth Anscombe, because of her Catholicism, is a sort of outlier, and there are some kind of arguments about that. But we can end on an argument.
Yeah, they're not in our book, the arguments. That's afterwards.
Yeah, abortion was the thought that immediately comes up, but I was wondering if there was anything else. I don't know if we have any more time. I think we've run out of time. I'm not sure if Anthony, the voice from above, can help us here. One more question. Okay.
Who are you going to pick, Elly?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I have to read them first. Okay, I'll go with Mark Carrigan. I don't know why, but I was fascinated by Rachel's explanation of how you try to write about them as people within a changing world. Could you say a little more about the implications of this approach for how you understand the work?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I guess, well, I'll try and say something and then Claire can try and make it sound a bit more sensible. I think one of the things that really excited us was thinking about so at one point, somebody asks Iris Murdoch in the 60s, what was it that kind of unified you and these other women, and you and Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot it's actually about. And she says, well, we were all interested in the reality that surrounds man, transcendent or whatever, which is really a really nice way of putting about it. But we kind of became really interested in this idea of understanding the reality that surrounds you, the transcendent reality, but in kind of grounding that out in just a very practical idea that, look, each one of us is just a tiny single living creature, close to the ground with a very short lifespan, who can only explore a particular local geography. And we're all in that situation. And yet at the same time, we're all trying to build this picture of this great pattern of human life, both at the now and back through history, and to make sense of the people around us, and to see each other justly, and to recognize the claims that other people have on us. So we were really interested in this idea that, the notion of a transcendent reality isn't some kind of grand metaphysical, doctrine or something. It's just the everyday real experience of being a living thing with a situated in space and time, trying to muddle your way through, and whose way of seeing is kind of shaped by what went before and what's going to come after, and who they are, and who's always vulnerable to coming to see their own past differently, coming to be seen differently. And I think that just made us really kind of sympathetic to that struggle that each one of us is, can be engaged in, I suppose. And I think that Clare always speaks really eloquently about this, but I think that their philosophy in particular, this is something that really infuses Iris Murdoch's philosophy. This recognition of the difficulty of the individual human who is trying to just get along and make sense of stuff as best they can.
Oh, that was
we all are.
We are. And I think for Iris Murdoch, art has a role to play here, and the novel, within the novel, there's a possibility of, obviously showing lots of different perspectives and trying to reconcile them. And, that's a way of sort of transcending our situatedness, I suppose, and trying to enlarge our vision. And also, she thinks that, looking at artworks, we can use them to triangulate, to kind of coordinate our different evaluative perspectives on the world. So art has a role to play, I think, in facilitating some kind of attempt at transcending our situatedness and limitations.